Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have our good friend James Lowery, who is back after 6 years of not being on the show. We actually had him last on in episode 90 talking about the vegan path to FI. And today is going to be as far from that as you can imagine. We're going to be talking ultimately about real estate and the lazy landlord, which I saw James do a presentation at the economy conference. And it just jumped out to me. And I said, I have to have him on the show to talk about this. It was just such a brilliant way of looking at both long term real estate rentals and short term rentals and essentially coming up with a system to make it work for you, to make the numbers work, to make it simple and to systematize it. And it just seemed like the perfect thing for the Choose By community. And James's story is wide ranging and super interesting. We're just going to have a really fantastic, rollicking good time here as we start from his inception to where he is today with 17 doors. So stay tuned. This is going to be a good one. With that, welcome to Choose FI. James, my friend, it is always good to see you. I feel like we see each other at conferences maybe once or twice a year, and I cannot believe it's been 6 years since you've been on the show.
Yeah, what can I say? Y'all are slacking.
Yeah, seriously. Seriously. Well, the funny thing is, you and I have talked behind the scenes about real estate a couple of times. I know you tried to convince me and it should have taken much less convincing, frankly. I should have done this 6 years ago to invest in Huntsville, Alabama, which is where you have identified as, I think, ultimately where you have all of your properties or in the greater Huntsville area. And it just seems like one of those really fantastic markets. I know I've mentioned before, I have a couple properties in rural Georgia, Warner Robins, Georgia. And I know Paula Pan has talked about Alabama and Georgia and places like that, that there are some real opportunities even today in 2024. And I think a lot of our community might say, oh, but real estate prices are insane. I could never get a house for under 100,000 or under 150,000, whatever it is. And I think that might be even today a limiting belief in some of these lower cost locales. Is there still a kernel of truth to that?
There is so much a kernel of truth to that because just to kind of illustrate my point, we've bought 17 properties, 17 doors, and the most recent purchase was 6 units. But before those 6 units, we had never bought a property for over $100,000.
Huh. Okay, so right, you just bought a multifamily or an apartment that had 6 doors, but before that you had 11. None of them were over 100K?
None of them were over 100K. And some of those include duplexes, houses with mother in laws, townhouses, condos. And so we've never spent more than $100,000 on a property.
Wow. So, right, I think a lot of people go down the wrong path when it comes to real estate investing. And I think that the key word there is investing because they think of real estate of their part of town, right? Like where their single family residence is. And they look at something like the 1% rule, which we've talked about a number of times, but hopefully maybe you could go over that again. And they say, it's impossible. I can't do it, right? I'm not even at the quarter of a percent rule for my $500,000 house is only going to rent for $2,000 a month. And okay, well, that's 0.4%, we'll say, but I'm directionally accurate, right? But yeah, I think you've found many properties now that fit that 1% rule. So, okay, talk us through that and just kind of the beginning back of the envelope economics of a property in your portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the 1% rule. So the 1% rule states that essentially you should be able to rent the property for 1% of the purchase price per month. So easy back of the envelope math. If you buy a property for $100,000, you should be able to rent that for $1,000 a month. So that's kind of the concept of the 1% rule. And it's a deeper dive after that, but that gives you back of the envelope. It's easy to determine whether or not a property is 0.5%. You're not going to make any money on that as a cash flowing rental. I will say that people are making money in every market in the country right now. It's just how are they investing? They might not be investing for cash flow. It might be for appreciation. It might be for, any number of things. But for us, cash flow was the most important thing because appreciation won't buy me groceries at the end of the month. And I need to live off of this. And our goal was to reach fire as quickly as possible. And we decided that real estate and leverage was the quickest way to do that. And we are not the people that say like leverage to the gills, have mortgages as much as you can. We're actually on the opposite end of that spectrum now. We're trying to pay properties down more and more. And to us, a small but mighty portfolio is kind of the idea that we want to go with.
Small and mighty real estate investor. I know we've had Chad Carson on to talk about it. And it's funny because that just so appeals to my brain too, James. There's just something really alluring about having like a moderately sized portfolio, whatever you decide that might be, 5, 10, in your case, 17 properties, which is pretty fantastic, obviously. But imagine instead of having 300 doors that, like you said, you're leveraged to the gills and maybe is a house of cards in some ways, but having 10, 15, 17 properties that are eventually fully paid off. And then all of that cash flow just comes directly to you, in essence, in the form of, I guess, to equate it to a stock, it could be like a dividend, right? So you're just cash flowing this every single month. So yeah, totally appeals to me. And I do want to go back to the inception of your real estate investing process. But you said there for a cash flowing rental, right? So this 1% rule as back of the envelope. So I think it's important to have a distinction, like you started alluding to there, of listen, we're not here to say this is the only real estate investing strategy that's going to work. I think there are many people who make tens of millions of dollars in some type of appreciation play, right? Of, hey, buying low, selling high in essence. But I know I've been down the speculation side of real estate and it didn't turn out too well. And I think for me, that cash flowing part of it just makes intuitive sense. It's looking at real estate as a business. So I know you said 1% is just kind of like the way you start, and then there's a lot more strategy from there. But do you stop at 1%? Is that the back of the envelope for where you, James Lowery, starts as, okay, this could conceivably be? Or do you have any wiggle room on that? Like, is it point 0.8? Is it 1.2? Maybe in Huntsville, like it might be 1.5. Who the heck knows? Like, talk me through like how you start on, hey, we're looking at property number 18 in the future. Where do you start?
So that's a great question. So I do want to mention that when I first started looking at real estate, it was the 2% rule. So
Ooh.
it was more than the 1% rule, it was double. And so, this is something that has kind of evolved with time as properties get more expensive, I guess. So to your point, the 1% rule, is that where I stop? I am actually not the type of person that does this meticulous, spreadsheet that determines all of these things. I kind of go with not necessarily gut. If the property is in the right area and it has the right cash flow opportunities. So there are times that, yes, we might purchase a property at 0.8%, but that's because it's in the path of progress. It's in an area that we think that there's going to be some growth. There's the potential for, longer term growth with rents, but also it might be a situation where it could be a condo and we don't have to worry about any exterior maintenance. We don't have to worry about anything like that. It's kind of a set it and forget it. And condos to me are very overlooked because no real estate investor really wants to deal with an HOA and no retail buyer wants to deal with an HOA. And most retail buyers are looking for single family homes in nice neighborhoods, especially in our area. So we think that condos are incredibly overlooked. We don't have a portfolio of all condos, but we do have a few. That's just like an example of something that is, we don't have to worry with any exterior stuff or anything like that. So back to kind of the question was, is that where I stop? Again, I could go from point 0.8 to anything over point 0.8. I'll look a little closer, specifically if it's in a neighborhood that we're targeting. We try to keep ours in little pockets of areas that we know are going to either appreciate. Also, we know that the path of progress is in that area. And one way to do that is to easily look at like the permits in your city to see what's being built. That's usually public information, but we also use our local subreddit. And so the subreddit, everybody's happy to prove how much they know on Reddit. And the second something like some development's coming through, somebody posts about it. And then we're like, okay, where is that development? Okay, is that going to be an area that we should be looking into? And so that's kind of the concept that we use.
Yeah, I like that. So, okay, I've got three more questions just from what you just said. So, you talked about little pockets. So, I understand path of progress and such. Are there other things that you consider, like maybe economies of scale or having all your property management under maybe a property manager? I think maybe we'll talk later about that you self manage, or at least the last time we spoke. But talk me through, I guess there's this balance, I think, for a lot of people who are looking to get into real estate investing, because that's ultimately what we're doing here is we're trying to just pass along info for someone who's on the fence, right? Like, I think there's the balance between being overly concentrated and the concerns of having all of my properties in one particular locale, and maybe the potential benefits of having all of them in one spot and building a team and not having to replicate that in 7 different cities across the country because you have 7 different properties and you didn't want to over concentrate. So, talk me through that kind of sliding scale balance of those two things.
Yeah, you kind of unpacked it there yourself. It's the idea that if I have all my properties in one place and there's one employer in the area that is like everyone's dependent on that, that might not necessarily be the best place to invest because if something were to happen to that employer for one reason or another, look at Detroit, you can look at any, coal mining town in the country, there are plenty of examples of one big employer having everything revolve around it. And then once it goes bust, the city goes bust. So we suggest picking an area that has a diverse income, a diverse like economy, and a lot of reasons for people to be there. Surprisingly, Huntsville happens to be one of those. A lot of people don't think of Huntsville as that. We do have some tourism through the Space and Rocket Center. So people are coming for space camp. It's the hub of a lot of major Fortune 500 companies like Boeing is here, Lockheed Martin is here, Northrop Grumman is here. Essentially, if you're in a government contracting, especially when it comes to aerospace, you're in Huntsville. And so for all of those companies to go belly up is probably unlikely. And then we have, some blue collar manufacturers in the area, which are great for renters as well, because it's the type of person that a lot of times it's a transient person with some of the jobs that come in. They don't think they're going to be here forever. They think they're going to end up at a Seattle Boeing, right? Or a Boeing in Charlotte or something like that. And so they are like white collar renters. And then we also have some blue collar renters in certain areas around town. So to us, it's a very diversified area. But kind of again, to your point, if you think like, oh, okay, I'm going to start investing in vacation rentals. I'm going to have a property in Orlando. I'm going to have a property in Pigeon Forge. I'm going to have one in Palm Springs, California. Now you have to have a different plumber. You have to have a different property manager. You have to have a different electrician. And so for us, not only some of ours are in the same neighborhood, we get to have the same guy that mows the lawn. And so I only have one point of contact that I can pay this one guy once a month to mow half my properties. And then the other half are in condos. So I don't have to worry about it at all. So that's kind of the opposite end of that spectrum, that I have to know 12 electricians, because not only do you need one electrician, right? You need 3 electricians because that guy might not be able to make it to your property in time. So now you need that for all 12 properties across, 12 states or 12 cities.
Interesting. Okay. So that makes perfect sense. And the other thing you said a minute ago was the 2% rule turned into the 1% rule as, quote, properties got more expensive. So my kind of accounting brain goes immediately to, okay, properties are getting more expensive, the purchase price, but it doesn't sound like rents are keeping up with that. And this is kind of outside the purview of real estate investing, but more just the general buy versus rent concept. So maybe like you and I can just have like a high level talk about that. Like, it seems to me anecdotally, and I've noticed that also in just in my Richmond area, that I'm shocked at how inexpensive rents are compared to purchase price. And when you're considering, I think I'm never trying to talk anyone in the Choosify community clearly into like, you should rent. It's the only thing to do. But I think because society says the opposite, you should buy your single family home. And that's the only thing to do because it's throwing money away to rent and blah, 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 all this nonsense. But when you look at just the cold hard facts of, wow, this doesn't make sense as a rental for the landlord because I'm getting it for so cheap, alarm bells should be going off in your head of, oh, wow, there's something here. Like this might have skewed so far towards renters that rental prices haven't kept up yet. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I agree 100% on that, because just conceptually, the idea that every property that's purchased, every landlord is making money, that does not make sense, right? That does not compute. And so there are plenty of situations where people are renting for a property for less than the mortgage would be today on that same property. And so, just as an example, we snowbird in Florida. So we have a long-term rental in Florida that we pay for year round. And so we rent for half the year in a location that it does not make sense to buy in. the numbers do not make sense in that area. And so because of that, we haven't bought there. There are plenty of places around the country that are like that. You should not buy in California. You should not buy in New York City. There are pockets of Atlanta that are good, And so the idea that you have to buy and invest in properties where you live is also not necessarily what you should do, right? One, it makes it easier to create the systems and to offload the work. The idea being that, like, if the property is 4 hours away from me, I'm not going to drive by to check on it, right? I'm not going to be the one that goes by and deals with some small maintenance issue. So you end up creating systems much earlier than you would if you were in town, because I am guilty of that myself. I was local to my properties. And so I was the handyman for a couple of years while we were accumulating. One, it was me being overly frugal. Two, I was available. And so in that situation, I wanted to be the one to have my hands on the property. But now, half the year, we're not even around our properties, at least half the year. There are times that we're traveling pretty extensively. There are times that I haven't met a tenant. We had a tenant for 2 years and I had never met him. He was placed while we were on a vacation in Europe. And then we met him on his final walkthrough 2 years later. So we had never met this tenant. We had never seen him, never talked to him. It was all online.
Damn. That's like the dream system. That's the dream renter for so many of us. That is awesome. And it's funny. I'm going to take a quick sidebar since you talked about snowbirding in Florida. So I've been so shocked at how many roller coaster enthusiasts there are in our community. It's absolutely astounding. And you and your wife Emily are roller coaster enthusiasts. So I've talked many times about my daughter Anna and now how we're taking these amazing trips all throughout the world. And she has one cooking up for Dubai and Abu Dhabi. As you know, there are Formula Rosas there and a whole bunch of other coasters. But yeah, we're gonna make our way down to the Tampa area to go on Iron Gwazi, and it's definitely a near term thing. What's your next bucket list coaster or park?
Yeah, so we're gonna go to Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. Is kind of like our this year's idea that we're going to hit, and we're gonna hit a few of the Kings Island, Kings Dominion. We're planning on hitting a few of those as well along the route.
Awesome. Okay. Well, King's Dominion is 30 minutes from my house. So I expect an email from you before you guys go there for sure. All right. Roller coaster sidebar over. But actually, it really is astonishing how many emails I get about, oh, we're roller coaster enthusiasts too. Or, oh, this is such a great getting season passes. Like you said, to Six Flags. You get a nationwide Six Flags pass for a couple $100. And talk about like a frugal, fun activity that you can do as like road trips and things like that. So, anyway. Let's start at the beginning. So, obviously, you don't wake up and have 17 properties. You've described, I know in the economy speech that I heard, really humble beginnings. And I'm curious if we could walk through just kind of the inception of like, how do you get from here, not to there, not to today, but how do you get from there to door number one? Like, what does that process look like? Because I would have to imagine that's the hardest part.
It is, especially pulling the trigger on the first one, because there's so much concern about, is this going to be right? Is this going to be wrong? And so, kind of to backtrack to the idea that real estate to me was always kind of life changing. So, my parents are deaf. And so I'm a coda. My sisters are codas, and so we were, negotiating car sales in elementary school, setting around doctor's appointments. So from that perspective, like, we grew up very quickly, and so a lot of the things that I felt like people had knowledge of, I didn't necessarily have knowledge of. For instance, I'm just going to use an example: 401ks. So I had heard the term 401k, thrown around occasionally as, a teenager, and I had no idea what it was. And I thought that other people knew what it was because their parents were talking about these things. And I thought that I just didn't have access to that information because my parents didn't have access to that information. Right. And so I think in my mind, parents are sitting around the table talking about 401ks with their kids. It turns out that's not true at all. Right. And so I thought I was on the back foot. So I decided to kind of focus on, what are 401ks? What are Roth IRAs? What are, these investment vehicles? I'm Googling this, pretty early on at an age that most people aren't, because I feel like I'm on the back foot. It turns out I was right with everybody else. But one thing was, I had read The 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. And actually, I had read The 4 Hour Body first because I was obsessed with fitness. And so I
Yeah.
thought, okay, if he's gamifying this, how else is he gamifying things? And so I read The 4 Hour Work Week, and he was talking about creating passive income streams like ebooks, like a blog, things like that. And he mentions real estate. And so at the time, I'm working as a manager at a gym. And I'm thinking to myself, I've got nothing to blog about. There's nothing that I'm going to like write an ebook about. So real estate's the only one that I can envision. And so I found Bigger Pockets, which is this community of real estate investors pretty early on. The problem was at the time I was making $12 an hour. And so I let my limiting beliefs get the better of me. And I thought, there's no way that I can afford to do this. So I had read a bunch about real estate investing and then just said, that's not really for me right now. And then I found the FI community. And then in that case, we had a ton of disposable income, not a ton, but we had more disposable income. And so we decided I already had this predisposition towards real estate because I already knew about it. And it also turns out to be one of the fastest paths to FI. And if that's the goal, is to get out of your 9 to 5 job, then real estate, I would say entrepreneurship's probably faster than real estate, than the index funds, but those also are on a scale of repeatability, of risk. And so entrepreneurship is a very high risk, but high reward. Real estate's somewhere in the middle, closer to the high risk, high reward. But then index funds is low risk, but low reward. But it's tried and true. There's 100% chance it's going to happen. So how do I get from here to there was the question.
Yeah, no, it's great.
So as I was growing up, again, my parents are codas. I see that my family is the family that like people will come and stay. And so like I'm not sure if this is true for the deaf community around the country, but I know that my mom had some friends and if they fell in hard times, they would come to her house and she would be the one housing them for, months and then they would, get back on their feet and then next thing you know they're moved out. And so that happened a number of times. And so very early on I realized that like real estate is kind of the safety net. It's like she owned her place and now she has it paid off, which is like a huge accomplishment for her. So we actually took her to Universal Studios to celebrate. She
Oh,
wanted to
wow.
go to Halloween Horror Nights as a 53-year-old woman. That's what
Yeah,
she wanted to do. I told her I would take her anywhere she wanted to, whatever she wanted to do, but that's what she
yeah.
chose. But owning real estate for her was like she was the crutch for a lot of people in her community and her circle of friends that they could fall back on. And so to me, seeing that like, okay, if I own this property, then like I can always fall back on that. And I always have somewhere to stay and somewhere to live. And we've kind of exemplified that by bouncing around between our units when we're not traveling. We will live at one of our Airbnbs and then we will continue to travel and we'll open it back up. And so anyways, that's kind of the concept that brought me to real estate.
Oh my goodness. James, there's so much there. I mean, we could spend 3 hours just unpacking what you just said. I think we might have to do a round two just on that, but it's astonishing. I mean, your mom, right? And just the fact that, like you said, real estate was this backstop, not just for her and your family, but for the community. I mean, that's just like what a special, special thing that is. I mean, that's remarkable. And, you look at things that some people on the outside might look at as a potential negative or a disability or whatever phrase we want to use, but sometimes that turns into a superpower, right? And it's astonishing for you in your life how being so much more involved in finances and talking about this and being part of it. I mean, goodness, that started for you. It sounds like as a teenager, right? And you were so far ahead. And I mean, you said repeatedly, like, I was worried about being on the back foot. And meanwhile, you're 7 steps ahead because this was a family who was doing this inclusively. I mean, that's amazing. So obviously, that's remarkable. And that helped you. But like you said, you were making $12 an hour. And that's not going to get you from here to there on buying your first property. And does the real estate journey start once you and Emily got married and different career choices started happening, or was it mostly just like a savings rate? I can't imagine it was a savings rate thing on $12 an hour. So talk me through like, okay, the next couple of steps.
Yeah, so you did mention my wife Emily, and so she was a key factor in all this, right? So she was the breadwinner as we were once we got married. She's an engineer for Boeing, and I do want to mention she hasn't worked there for years, so don't blame her for all the issues that they're having right now.
Oh God.
um, that was a sidebar. So she had a significant income, at least significantly more than mine, and so between the two of us, we were making around $100,000 a year, and
Okay.
that gave us the ability to have a high savings rate that we could then put into properties. And so once we found financial independence, we really downgraded and downgraded sounds extreme. It wasn't a downgrading to us. It was fun. It was gaming the system. We had gone from a fancy condo in a fancy area to a much smaller condo for a third of the price. Actually, I think it was a fourth of the price. And so from there, we sold our cars. We did all these different things to try to have a higher savings rate. And at the time, we didn't have any money. So that was part of the reason why we only bought properties for under $100,000, is because that's all we had the cash for to put down payments on. And at the time, all of our properties, for the first 10, 12 properties we got, we went to the bank, did a traditional mortgage. We were not doing anything creative. We just did like everybody else does when they buy the regular house. We were putting 15, 10, 20% down on properties. So sometimes we were having to pay PMI, sometimes we weren't. It depended on how much money we had in our pockets at the time that we could then put towards a property. And so that was one of the key factors as to why we bought cheaper properties, is because that's all we could afford at the time. And that's what made it easier to accumulate quicker. But we did have some career changes and career choices that happened. So I went from making $12 an hour at a gym to kind of picking up at the bottom of a physical therapy clinic and then working my way up the ladder there to then I was a district manager over the administrative side. And so from that perspective, I went from being like a PT tech to then being like one of the administrative people, then an administrative manager, then the manager of the region. And so part of that's just work ethic, showing up. And the idea to us was that our real estate, we were using that to invest, but the companies that we were working for were really our biggest investors. So we were viewing them as our partners, right? They're the ones that are giving us the money. So we need to put in the work and do what we can to show that we can be promoted, to make more money, to do all these things so that we can then have more money to put into real estate. And so, our companies that we were working for were actually our biggest investors.
That is super cool. So, yeah, I mean, just embedded in there is really like the encapsulation of your five story, right? It's, hey, we're going to, in essence, upskill ourselves and we're going to try to earn significantly more money in our day jobs. You cut your expenses, it sounds like, by 60 to 75%, or your structural expenses at least. You saved all that money and you started investing. And obviously, whatever investment we choose, I mean, that's our own personal preference. Clearly, in hindsight, obviously, the real estate investing has worked out marvelously for you. But I mean, that is the path to FI, right? And it's cool to see how that can happen almost on a dime like that. And I want to just slow down real quick on the all right, we cut our structural expenses 75%. Because I think for a lot of people, even people on the path to FI, right, is hey, we're earning so much more money now. We're earning way more than we ever maybe dreamed of. Certainly when I was making $12 an hour, that's not a time to cut. If anything, maybe you loosen the purse strings a little bit, but you guys went the complete opposite way. And there's something psychologically there that is maybe I think you take it for granted as, oh, this is just what we did. But there's something special there. And I'm curious, like, did you guys have conversations about life goals? Was it like a larger picture thing, or was it just like a day-to-day granular, all right, this is the next step we need to take? I'd love to hear like how that started.
It was a little bit of both. It was like, what do we conceptually want our life to be? And so for us, we dreamed of, quitting our jobs and retiring to go to Europe. And my wife, Emily, didn't really enjoy being an engineer. And so for that, she didn't enjoy her day job. She didn't enjoy going to work, seeing the people that she was not necessarily the people, but the lifestyle that they had created for themselves. There were people that were dying at their desk. There was a study that came out that the average Boeing employee takes their pension for less than 18 months because they end up dying from heart attacks or whatever stress. And so for us, it was this concept like, let's create the life that we want. How quick can we do it? And it sounds very easy now, but this was over the course of, a year we had downgraded. Again, I used the term
Yep.
downgraded, and from the outside looking in, our families thought that we had like problems. They thought that we had financial problems because
Oh,
we
wow.
went from living in this fancy condo and having nice cars to downgrading to a smaller condo to then, and part of this is also like, I would have lived in a van by the river if I could have. But, there are certain standards that my wife luckily has because it would have just been terrible lifestyle wise. And so that's kind of another aspect of it, is that like if I'm in something, I'm 100% in, and it is like, I'm going to burn the bridges on my way across. So it took a little bit of convincing to get, and convincing is not even the right word. It was, the concept of like, what do you want with life? And so that got my wife on board, because at first she wasn't on board with Phi, and actually taking her to a Camp Phi event where she saw there were actual, real, normal people doing this, and they had successfully done it, right? And we had met Justin from Root of Good, went to his house, met his family, and then rode with him from his house to the camp. And so to her, she's like, okay, these are real people. This isn't some like weird concept online that James has stumbled upon and now he's obsessed with. And so it was this slow, gradual change to the point that we, went from a nice condo to a smaller condo to a mother-in-law suite of a house that we bought. So we were living in the mother-in-law suite, and we're living for free at that point. We're house hacking, right? But our families, specifically my wife's family, really thought that we were in dire straits. They were concerned. They gave us a ride to the airport to go to a Camp Phi, and they asked us what we were going to. And I was like, oh, it's a financial camp. It's like a boot camp, and we didn't really know because we hadn't been yet. So we're trying to describe something that we don't really know what it is,
Yeah.
frankly. And she was like, I just want y'all to know that everybody struggles, everybody has hard times. And the funny thing is at that time we were doing better financially than we ever had. We had tens of thousands in the bank, and from the outside looking in, when we were doing great, we were living paycheck to paycheck. We were happy at the end of the month if we had $1,000 in our account, right? And we were like, hey, we need to not buy this until the mortgage comes out. Like, we have texts going back and forth about like how we needed to manage what little money we had. And then now we're doing the best we've ever done, but everybody else thinks we're doing bad. They think that I've got a gambling issue, or that there's like, some loans somewhere. Who knows what? I don't know what they were thinking, but it's just kind of funny that the outward appearance is what people really take a hold of. But now that's not necessarily the case, because they see the lifestyle that we live. And now they understand that like the sacrifices, I'm going to use that term pretty loosely, that we made then definitely paid off.
Yeah, it was all in service of something. And I think this community, the Phi community, are the ultimate millionaires next door, right? It's the people who are unassuming, and you would never guess by their clothes and their cars that so many of us are millionaires, right? Or on the path to that. And yeah, it's so interesting. That is hilarious that Emily's parents thought you were going essentially to some like remedial finance camp for like marriage counseling, it sounds like, right? Like, but I mean, I guess it's not an unrealistic assumption if they don't know any better. But you guys, again, were doing it all in service of the life that you wanted to live. And yeah, it's amazing to see where you are today. And essentially, as far as I understand it, financially independent from your real estate rentals at a really, really young age. It's absolutely wild. So I'm kind of getting way ahead of the game here. But okay, so one thing I heard in there was you got like traditional mortgages. Now, like, did you live in these places for a little bit? Like, how does that work exactly? Because I think probably some questions arose when you said that, like, for the aspiring real estate investor, like, are there different options for mortgages? Like, is that generally the accepted way to do it? Is to like get a primary residence mortgage, or am I misunderstanding entirely?
No, there are definitely different options. So, for instance, one of the places we would buy and live in it knowing that we were going to move out of it in a year. So, at that point, you have kind of satisfied your mortgage, like the paperwork that you sign that says, I am going to live in this property for at least a year. And then from there, you get to maintain that same mortgage. So, that means that you get to put less percentage down. That also means that you get a better interest rate. Now, alternatively, you can buy a property as a rental property, as an investment property. And typically, they will require 15% down. And if it's a multifamily property, so for instance, a duplex, triplex, or anything like that, then they require 25% down. So that kind of changes the numbers on that. But, the interest rates are just higher. It's typically 1 basis point at least higher than what your traditional mortgage is for a house that you're going to buy. So, for instance, if the mortgage rates right now are 6%, then for an investment property, it's going to be 7%, if not a little bit higher than that. That's just kind of a rule of thumb.
Okay. So right, 1% higher on the interest rate generally. So okay. And obviously it goes without saying, and James has just reiterated that there is no fraud going on here. You're not misrepresenting to the mortgage company that you intend to live in here. Like, you are fulfilling the stipulations in the mortgage requirement. And you obviously have to read on your mortgage. This is all, your mileage may vary. You need to look into it. But it sounds like the boilerplate language, James, as I'm understanding it, is I intend to live here for 1 year. And once you fulfill those requirements, then, like you said, you get to keep your nice mortgage that's on like a primary residence, but still rent the thing out. So that is a cool little hack that is not really a hack, right? It's just knowing the rules in essence.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, it gave us a year to do some thoughtful upgrades to the place, paint the cabinets, put in new appliances. So we're not like killing ourselves trying to get a place ready so quickly. We get to wait for the deals to kind of come to us and then just kind of jump on them as we do. And then for us, it was typically a little over a year that we were living in a place, and we only moved out when the right property popped up that we could then do the same thing to. So we could owner occupy. So for instance, I mentioned that mother-in-law apartment that we were living in. That's the same concept. We could live in the apartment and put 5% down on the property, and we qualified for a better mortgage rate because we were living in the property, and then we could rent out the main house because we're still living on the property. So because of that, we get the residential real estate like mortgage, the rates, everything like that, the less percentage down as we're living in it, but we also have a section of it that we can rent out. And so that's kind of the concept behind like a house hack or anything like that. Like a duplex, a traditional duplex house hack would be you live in one unit, so you get the lower interest rate and you're renting out another portion of it. So you're kind of offsetting some of your living expenses. For us, the house was big enough and the apartment was small enough that we were actually living 100% for free, including our utilities, our internet, everything. So our living expenses to live in that apartment were zero.
Wow. Yeah, house hacking is like the secret key to life. I feel like that's the one thing on my financial journey, or one of a very short list that I would do over is, yeah, if I had the opportunity, man, if you're in your, not just limiting belief, I'm saying here, if you're in your 20s, but I mean, it could be any age, obviously, but goodness, if you're starting out and you're in your 20s and you can figure this out, that is just the key to life. It's remarkable. So I do want to drill down just on one last thing here. So before, when you said that if you're getting more of like a, not quite, I know there's some very specific terminology, so I don't want to say commercial because I think there is a line of delineation there, but let's say a triplex or a quad, right? You said generally you're going to need 25% down on something like that. But then in there you said, like, if you're living in one of like a duplex, you can still get the lower residential. Do you know if that applies to the triplex and quads if you're living in one of the 3 or 4 units, or is there just like the line of delineation, or is that outside of the scope of where you've come across?
No, that does apply. So, for instance, if you live in one of the four units in a quadplex, you get to qualify for the 5% down. The difference being when you put it as little down as you can, one, you don't have as much equity, right? And so there's a little more risk involved from that perspective if the property were to kind of depreciate for any reason. So that's kind of a risk. Another thing is you're paying PMI, which is mortgage insurance, right? And so sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it isn't. We've put down as little as 10% on a property, knowing that we were going to have to pay PMI, but the PMI ended up being like $16 a month. And so for us, the opportunity cost of that extra 10% that we could use towards something else made more sense. So we would just pay the $16 for as long as we had to.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, it's funny how I think a lot of us just reflexively say, like, oh, we don't want to pay any fees. And I think that's good advice, generally speaking. But sometimes you have to look at the more holistic picture of, hey, in this case, if the case is $16 a month and the opportunity cost clearly says, hey, we could do a lot better with this lump of cash, like roll it into another property or do whatever. I mean, then that seems like a no brainer to me. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a cool illustration of just like, think a little more broadly. I think it's easy to think myopically and just like look at that one little, oh, I just hate paying that PMI, you know? But yeah, that's super cool. So, okay. I think we've gone through like the early days, and it sounds like, this was just, I certainly don't want to say a slow methodical process because it doesn't sound like it was slow, but it sounds just very thought out and methodical. And hey, we're gonna live in this place, then we're gonna rent it. We're all the while looking for other opportunities, and we're just going to keep expanding. And so you told me before we hit record, you just bought a 6 unit place. So that expanded from 11 units to 17 you have now. And maybe we could talk a little bit about the process and the, and the whole thing you have going on with renovating this 6 unit place. But as I understand it, you guys considered yourself financially independent at 11 units. And I'd love to hear just kind of like a general overview of like how you thought of and think of your financial life with 11 units, I guess.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on it earlier about like the focus on real estate. I do want to mention we maxed out both of our Roths and we maxed out one 401k every year. So we still have index funds to fall back on. They're just growing in the background while we live off of the cash flow. So that's kind of the key part of cash flow was, it would have taken us so many more years to create the amount of money that we did through real estate. But the 11 units we were definitely financially independent on, right? So we quit our jobs in 2019 at 28 and 29 and moved to Europe. And at that time, we had 9 long-term rentals and we had one short-term rental. And the idea of the one short-term rental was we actually weren't planning on doing any short-term rentals. We were in the process of selling off all our stuff to move to Europe. And one of our tenants turned in their notice to move. And so now we only had like a week to place a tenant before we were going to Europe. And we didn't trust our tenant placement process at that time remotely. Like, so we had placed all our tenants there while we were in town. And it is a little bit of a process. It's a fun process for me. I actually enjoy it a lot, but I don't trust that it's going to happen within a week. And so for us, we were in the process of selling off our things and we were like, well, let's just take our things, put it into this apartment, and then we can try to short term rent it. We'll do it for 6 months. If it doesn't work, then we can always turn it back into a long term rental. And so the concept was while we're in Europe, we can, have this short term rental. And then when we come back into town for whatever reason we need to be in town, visiting family, whatever the case may be, we can always just block off the calendar and use the space ourselves. It's our own things there anyway. It's our couch, it's our, appliances, it's everything we need to live somewhere. So that kind of kickstarted this process. And we had that all the way through. And then it turns out that being a nomad and traveling around a bunch wasn't as cool during COVID, right? So we got shut down in Europe and it was a pretty crazy process. We had to take a repatriation flight from Cyprus to the US. So they only opened the airport for our one flight to repatriate some people back to the UK. And then we got to the UK and it was like London Heathrow was a ghost town. This was at the
Oh
height
my
of
God.
COVID. This was like the peak COVID time. There were people walking around in hazmat suits. There was only 2 flights out that day, I think, from London Heathrow. So then we flew from there back to the US. And the reason why is one, we thought that all our tenants weren't going to pay. Like there were all these eviction moratoriums. I mean, everybody was being laid off. It turns out that most of our tenants were going remote or had found other jobs where they could do that. We didn't have a single late payment, much less a missed payment. So that's kind of a credit to our tenant placement process and our tenants. And another part of that is that we are like quality landlords. We attract the type of people that we want as opposed to just taking whoever can come in. And so part of that is having a quality property, being a quality person, a quality manager of the property is a key part to this. But during that, then we moved back to the US because one of our tenants had turned in their notice to move. And so we moved into one of our units and then renovated it. And so, anyways, I believe your question was,
No, it's awesome.
what did our financial life look like? So we were living, I mean, to us, we were no longer living frugally. Like I have the healthiest relationship with money today than I ever have in my life. When we first quit our jobs, it was, is this going to work? Because, we didn't really know if at the time we had just launched a couple of rentals, we had just gotten a few tenants. And so we hadn't lived off of just our rental income. We had our, W-2 job income coming in up until the day that we quit, essentially. Now, I will say we dipped our toe into the water as opposed to just like outright quitting. Both of us took leave of absences to see if it was going to work. So for me, it was only 30 days. If we miscalculated and we only lasted 30 days, there was some serious issues, So if we didn't make it that long, there was going to be some issues. So we knew that that one was kind of a done deal. But Emily had a 6 month leave of absence. And so that was us kind of dipping our toe into the water. If it didn't work, she could always come back. And so we actually got lucky with the timing of COVID because had it happened, a month earlier, we might would have thought the sky is falling and she would have gone back to work. But instead, she had already turned in her notice. The end of the 6 months had happened, and then COVID became a bigger deal. So luckily, it happened when it did. I hate to say that it was like it
Of
was.
course.
It wasn't a good thing, obviously, but at the same time, if it was going to happen, I'm happy it happened a month later than it did.
Yeah. Wow, that is crazy story.
Yeah,
Holy cow.
yeah. It was pretty bizarre.
That's wild. So, okay. It doesn't sound at least from the inception, it's not like you were buying these things in cash, right? So you obviously had mortgages. I do want to talk about your screening process, the tenant screening, because that jumps off the page to me. Because the being a quality person, being a quality landlord, and all the tenant screening. But before we get there, just again the nuts and bolts. So today, are you actively trying to pay down your mortgages? Because again, there's a lot of like financial implications. It sounds like your guys' expenses are really, really low, and it sounds like you're living potentially internationally for some part, and you're living in some of your properties for others, which is just so cool and brilliant that you get to just like zip across and go to these different places. But still, there obviously are costs of life, and you're getting the cash flow, but you're paying a mortgage on each of these properties every month. And there's some again balance of, hey, do we take all the cash now? Do we invest it in index funds? Do we pay down the mortgages? Maybe if you got them all in the good old days of 2 and 3% interest rates, I mean, is there an incentive to paying them down? How do you think about that? And how do you think about like as part of that? I hate to ask three questions at once, but like the 15-year plan. Is the 15-year plan to have 30, 50, 100 doors, or is it to have these 17 properties that are all paid off and just every dollar of cash flow is accruing to you?
So the latter is definitely the goal. So it might be 20 at that point, but to us, we were financially free at 10, we were financially free at 11, we're financially free definitely at 17. But for us, it was going to be like a fun project. We've wanted these properties, like that's the reason why we bought them for, like 5 years now. They came up before we quit our jobs, but they were just like it was again a limiting belief. I didn't believe that we could get them. And so the idea being like we do own one property now free and clear, and so if it hadn't been for these properties, the new 6 unit, we probably would be paying our properties off as opposed to trying to accumulate more. But the right opportunity came up, and so it depends. And it's as easy as changing your mind on something. It can be very fluid. There are times that I'm like, you know what, I want to pay off all the mortgages. And then there are times that I see a 6 unit and I'm like, you know what, that's going to be a really fun project. Let's not pay off the mortgages. And so it's kind of one of these things. It's like six of one, half dozen of the other. It can always change depending on what your goals are. And, for us, we don't want 100 doors, right? So the idea would be we have a lot of equity built up in a lot of these properties. If we wanted 100 doors, we could just get this big portfolio loan and take a lot of that money out of the properties and then use that to buy more. But we don't want more leverage, even though we just signed on to take this 6 unit. So, take all this with a grain of salt. But now it's turned into what will be a fun project? What can I do with my time, in retirement? And it's like, I actually enjoy doing the renovations. I do not like to do any repairs, right? So I'm not going and dealing with like, a plumbing issue or things like that. But if I'm going to take down a wall and move it, that's fun for me. Or, the concept that like we use for our short-term rentals is we have a very specific avatar in mind. And so it's always fun to put ourselves into their shoes and say, okay, what is this person coming for? What would they like in the property? What are their issues going to be? And how can we solve those issues before they have them? And what would they like as the decor? So it's not necessarily for me anymore. It's not what does James like? It's what does this person like? And so it's a fun process for us.
That is really cool. And yeah, it's interesting that again, our FI journey and even post FI, like things can change on a dime and that is okay, right? I mean, it sounds like you're in the early stages now of this renovation of these 6 new units, right? And like you are doing a significant part of the renovation, which is wild. Like so I mean, it's not like you're just kind of waltzing into Huntsville for 5 days and seeing the property and leaving and going to Cyprus or wherever. You're it sounds like going to be in Huntsville for a while. And again, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea, and there are times again that this changes. It's like we want to spend as much time during the winter in a warm location, right? So we go to Florida. We've spent a few months in Mexico, and then there will be. Last year we spent 7 weeks in Europe traveling around, and so it's like different times there are different places to be, and our families are in Huntsville. So for us, it's an opportunity for us to spend time with our friends, our family, in the time that it's like getting warm, but it's not unbearably hot yet. And the same idea for Florida. There's no way that you would catch me in Florida in July. Like it's not the place to be. So July, for instance, we're planning to go to Colorado and spend the month hiking because we're planning to do Kilimanjaro in August. And so it's like life just happens and you get to take on these fun things that you want to do. And if I have to take a 2 to 3 month detour in Huntsville and end up spending more time with my family and friends, that's not the end of the world.
No, that sounds pretty good. So, okay, I don't obviously want to get into like precise numbers. That's not usually the game I play here. But let's just say hypothetically, each of these doors on this unit was 100 grand, right? You said something about that number before. So 600,000. If you're putting 5% down, you have to come up with 30 grand, 10% down, 60 grand. So, I mean, there's a significant amount of cash that needs to be put into this, right? How, because I think this is something also like potential real estate investors or fledgling real estate investors are curious about. Like, do you just have that sitting around like in your real estate LLC's bank account for like, hey, we might distribute this out to our own personal account. We might pay down the mortgages, or we might want to have optionality for the future of buying a big unit or buying more units. Like, what do you actually do with the cash? Like, was this, hey, we needed to sell our own index funds on the personal side, or like was this more the business side, if that makes sense?
So yeah, there are kind of a few things to unpack there. So I think that most people that are involved in real estate are typically a little cash heavy. I think that that's just like a natural way to lean because there are emergencies that happen. There are things like that that happen. And so if you're an index fund investor, it's a lot easier for you to kind of project what your expenses are going to be for the next 6 months to a year. And overall, for a year, you can kind of do the same thing with real estate. But at the same time, there will be times that something happens. There might be a property that pops up that you want to be able to buy. And so, just for example, we have bought properties with cash so that we can close quickly. We don't have to go through an appraisal. We can do these things. And so our offers become that much more enticing. And then we turn around and refinance 6 months later once the title has seasoned enough. And then we can pull our money back out. So that's one thing. We do keep kind of more in cash than most, I would say, early retirees do because of the kind of heavy leaning towards real estate. Now, particularly on this property, I will say once you get 5 or more units, it turns into a commercial loan. So we structured the deal completely differently on this one. So we actually have a couple of partners on this deal. And so we are the sweat equity. We're the ones that brought the deal to them. And so they have put in, 25%. And then we have a hard money lender that we then plan to pay out. That way, we've essentially done the same concept with this. We've bought it with cash. And then in 6 months, we can turn around and refinance our portion of it as opposed to, the partner's portion of it, right? So all we have to do is get out 50% of the money to refinance our portion of it, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. That's brilliant. I love that. And thanks for diving into that. That was really helpful. So, we mentioned tenant screening before. And this is actually part of what jumped off the page to me when I heard your economy speech, which we are going to link in the show notes. And it was just awesome. What a great, just wonderful, wonderful presentation. So, you knocked that out of the park. I don't know if we're going to have time to go through every aspect of the lazy landlord concept, but I really, for people who are interested, I definitely would recommend watching that speech. And then I know you have a ton of resources on your website, which is rethinktheratrace.com. And it looks like you have a lazy landlord boot camp. I'm not sure. It says join the wait list as of now. So I'm not sure if this is currently active, but let's start with tenant screening. Because I think, again, you have come up with a system that not only just works to make it easier, but most importantly, to get your desired outcome. And that, James, was what I took away from your system was in every aspect of this, you're pushing to get your desired outcome. And there is a fundamental distinction between, okay, this is just hands off, this is lazy. And man, I'm going to do everything I can to build processes that work and get me what I want. And in this case, tenant screening, I think, is the most important starting place.
Yeah, so this is something that came out of it's been definitely like a passion of mine, but it also came out of necessity because I do manage all our properties, even remotely when we're in Florida, when we're in Mexico, when we're abroad. I manage all our properties. And so to me, the key part to this is, especially with long term rentals, but even with short term, you want the type of people that are going to make life easier for you. And so, because of that, that's kind of what I brought up. It's important to have the type of property that is going to attract that type of person. And so the tenant screening process is a pain point for most people. I actually enjoy it. It's my favorite part of the long-term rental portion of like managing real estate. It's my favorite part. So there is a key part to this. One is that the same process has to apply to every single person. Otherwise, you're opening the door to, some lawsuits. Like I can actually tell you, I know someone that says that they change their security deposit based on whether or not they like the person. And that sounds like the most outlandish thing I've ever heard in
Yeah.
my life. That is like, now you've turned real estate from an asset to a liability. So don't do that, right?
Yeah.
So a
Totally.
key part to this is it has to apply to every person the same way. So my tenant screening process, what happens is I list the property, and I will say it depends on what the price of the property is, because in our area you can still find properties for less than $1,000 to rent. So if it's under $1,000, I have better luck on Facebook Marketplace. If it's over $1,000, I have better luck on Zillow. But I still list them in both places. I just want to mention that it's important to put them where you're going to get the right type of person that's going to match what you're looking for in a tenant. So from there, anybody that inquires about the property, I tell them that we will schedule showings after we have received a pre screening questionnaire. And some people charge a screening application. I don't want to do that. I think it's kind of one, I think it's a little bit sleazy, but that's not like, I'm not judging anybody that does it. It's just that that's their hoop that they've chosen for people to jump through. Some people don't have any hoops. For me, it's a pre screening questionnaire. So I have it linked to a Google form, so I send them a Google form that then asks them, and it's a sliding scale of, what their income is, how many people are going to live in the property, are they going to have dogs? Yes, no. Do they smoke? Yes, no. What their employment is, different things like that. It's just all the basic questions to pre-screen someone. Now, the fun part is this then auto populates a Google sheet that tells me yes, no, whether or not they are qualified, right? So it then color codes it and says they smoke, they don't make enough money, whatever the issue may be, because they have to make 3x the rent. So that's the first part to this process. One, 90% of the people that inquire about the property are never going to fill this form out. And that's perfectly fine with me because I don't want that type of person. I want the person, it doesn't take any money. All they have to do is spend 5 minutes filling out this form, and then they can then see the property. That's all it takes. But 90% of the people will not do that. And so that alone tells me that this is the type of person that's going to follow a process, and they're going to be the type of person that I want. Right. And then from there, they see the property, and then I show them the property, and then I tell them what my management style is going to be. We have automated rent collection. We have our maintenance requests all go online. Right. And so I tell them exactly what the process is going to be. And then from there, if they want to choose to have the property, they can. Another thing we do is we schedule all our showings in one day so that it's a little bit of salesmanship to it, but as someone's leaving, they see someone coming up to the property to view it. And as they're leaving, they see someone else coming up to the property to view it, right? So it creates a little bit of urgency as opposed to me scheduling a showing on a Friday afternoon and then another one on Saturday. They don't see anybody coming. And then they say, oh, I'll think about it. I'm going to kick the can down the road for a few days. This kind of puts the ball in their court. Do you want the place or not? And if you do, you better beat someone else to it. But the other part of it is I don't care who gets it because I've already pre-screened all the people, right? So any of these people that decide I'm going to go ahead and put down my security deposit, which we've had people do before they've left the property because they see people coming and going, they're like, I want this place. This is a nice guy. It's a nice area. He's priced it accordingly. He's got this process in place. I'm not having to jump through all these like crazy things to pay him rent or to do a maintenance request. And I've laid out the whole process. So that makes it a lot easier for us to find a tenant. And then from there, we will then do a background and credit check. And then we will double check their employment, make sure that they're actually employed where they say they are. We'll call, if it depends. This is something that we've done recently is gotten references from landlords. And so that way we can call and we'll verify that, okay, where did they live? Ask some questions that isn't just like their friend that they've given this number to, right? And so
Right.
from there, you go a little deeper into the tenant screening as far as, background and credit check. But the pre-screening process is what gets us the right person. And so then we don't have to worry about the rest of the process.
That is so cool. And really, frankly, the pre-screening process, once now that we're talking about it, it's so obvious. It's simple, but yet it's not because nobody, essentially, vanishingly few people are doing that, right? Just doing that simple weeding out process, which sounds like a two-step thing, right? So it's the questionnaire, which weeds out 90%, obviously, and getting all the answers and making sure that they qualify to then see the place. But then also you explaining how you're going to work. This needs to work mutually here. And if they're just not a right fit, they're obviously not going to put a security deposit down. They're going to walk away, no harm, no foul. But you're in essence building this environment for getting people that are going to work well with you. And I mean, James, that puts you ahead of 99+% of real estate investors right there with a fairly simple and replicable process, I think, for a lot of people listening. So that's super cool.
And a key part to this is we've actually done this entire process remotely. We can do the screening remotely. And then what we do is we've paid a local investor who happens to be a friend of ours to show the property. And so on a Saturday morning, she goes out there, shows the property, and then she gets paid half the first month's rent to show the property. So for her, it's an easy thing. She unlocks the door and then she has essentially a Google Doc of like, these are the things that I want you to talk to them about. This is how we're going to do rent collection. This is how we're going to do maintenance issues. And so we've done the entire process while we were in Europe and placed a tenant. That's the tenant that I mentioned that I hadn't met until he was doing his walkout. 2 years later, he was doing his move out, inspection, and we happened to be in town for that. So we went and met the tenant. Otherwise, I would have never met this tenant. He would have lived with us for 2 years, and that's something that definitely happens with people that have like 500 units. They've never met a person, right? But for somebody that has 10 units, right, that doesn't necessarily happen because a lot of people try to be a little hands on. And so you don't set up systems for one property, but you do for five or six, and definitely for 10, it makes the whole process much, much easier.
Yeah. Are there any other just simple tips like on the being a good landlord side that you have that just like jump out to you that are like, oh, if the choose of my listeners could think of one thing, like this is it?
We are really over the top with our maintenance issues, right? So if anybody submits a maintenance issue, we get it sent over to a handyman. And if they can't make it, we send it to the next handyman. And we actually have a Google Doc that tells us, like, okay, here are the three plumbers. And then they're in order of importance, right? So it's like, this one's the fairest, they show up on time, and then they get added to the list, right? And so we kind of go through this list of, okay, if the handyman can't do it, we send everything to our handyman first because they're going to be the cheapest and they're typically the quickest. And so then if they can't do it, then we'll pass it on to an electrician, a plumber, whoever that may be. So for us, that's a key part to the process. Another thing is if anybody asks for anything, then we try to, like, especially if they're a good tenant. I'm not saying like we don't treat anybody poorly, but there was a tenant who had been there for a couple of years and he said, "Hey, the dryer is like not really doing great." So we bought him a brand new washer and dryer, had it installed. So he's got like a brand new LG washer tower. And so now he is like the happiest guy in the world. And for us, that was like, he's been such an easy tenant to deal with. He pays on time. And it's like something like that, it definitely helps. And there are tenants that, say, "Hey, can we do XYZ?" Right. And we want them to feel at home. This is their place as far as we're concerned, right? While they're living there. And so they'll plant flowers, they'll put out planter boxes, they'll do things like that. And if anything, something that we've explored doing, I'm not going to say we've done it a bunch, but something that we've explored doing is, "Hey, what upgrade would you like done this year?" Right. And so, for instance, that's what happened with the washer dryer guy. Right. So it's like, what pain point do you have at this property right now? And how can we make that easier for you?
Hmm. I like that. I like that a lot. So you've mentioned this online portal a couple times. So it sounds like that's where you automated rent collection plus these requests for the maintenance. So that's really cool. That's just a neat way to come up with a system. And then, so you mentioned the handyman and trying to stay on top of maintenance. Do you send him or her out to like once or twice a year to the properties to kind of like eyeball things, or like how does that work for like preventative maintenance?
This is something that, like, some people do take kind of contention with in the real estate world. It feels like you're like trying to keep eyes on them. What we do is we do that exact thing, though. I will say that. So we explain that when we're doing the walkthrough with the potential tenant when they're applying for the property. We say, "Hey, by the way, we do a quarterly maintenance walkthrough where we're going to send the handyman over and they're going to change out the air filters. They're going to check for plumbing leaks. They're going to check the roof line to make sure there's no roof leaks. And if there's anything that's nagging while you haven't submitted a maintenance request for, they can take care of that while they're here." Right. And so it's like, a screw is loose. They're not going to submit a maintenance request for that. Or like, like the toilet seat comes loose. Like that's something that's like kind of a silly maintenance request. Like they don't feel like they should submit something for that, but they get that taken care of during the quarterly maintenance walkthrough. And the key part to that is it's definitely a benefit for us. It's also a benefit for them. But most landlords, and in real estate, this is kind of like the, I guess, rule of thumb is that your tenants are responsible for changing the air filters, right? So a $5 or $10 air filter is going to determine the life of my HVAC unit, right? And they're never going to change it. They're never going to change it. And so it's like, just send someone over once a quarter. It's once every 3 months, to change out the air filter. And now the life of your HVAC that you're going to be responsible for repairing is so much longer, right? You get to nullify any, leaks under the sink or anything like that. And that's something that we started implementing because we had people that were like neglecting to submit maintenance requests because they were hiding the fact that they had like a pet or something like that. They didn't want to pay the pet fee.
Interesting. Yeah, it's, the opposite of penny wise, pound foolish, right? It's like you're thinking about, okay, repairing or replacing an HVAC system is going to cost me many, many, many thousands of dollars. And if I can get X number of years of useful life out of it by just sending somebody to just change the damn air filter, right? Like it's so simple. But yeah, to your point, there are zero renters, essentially, zero renters in America who are going to buy air filters and replace them every 3 months. It just doesn't happen. So yeah, that's really, really neat. So okay, we've kind of gone through most of like the long-term rental, lazy landlord. I think the short-term rental is going to be outside the scope of what we're doing. Maybe we'll do a shorter episode just on that. And we'll obviously send people to your website because I think that's going to really interest a very small subset of people who are interested in doing short-term rentals. But for those people, it's going to be highly, highly effective. Did we miss anything on the long-term rental kind of lazy landlord conceptual framework?
So you mentioned the portal that we use, right? So we use apartments.com. It's free to use. There's also Stessa and Avail, and there are plenty of them that exist that, are essentially free to use. The way that they make their money is the background and credit checks, but they field all the maintenance requests and things like that. So one thing that we have told tenants is that if it's an emergency, you're obviously welcome to contact us directly. We want to know like if there's an emergency. The problem is now we've had to explain what an emergency is because we did have a tenant who called us like within his first week of living there and said, "Hey, where do cats hide? Like, where would cats hide in the neighborhood?" He was watching his sister's cat and it got
Okay.
out or something. It was like the most bizarre thing. So now we've explained to people that emergency involves a fire, flood, or blood. If it involves one of those three things, definitely call us. Otherwise, submit a maintenance request
Yep.
because it's going to get resolved quicker if you submit a maintenance request than if you call me or text me or anything like that. Because I can immediately forward that on to the handyman or the plumber or the electrician, whoever it may need to be to resolve whatever this issue is, as opposed to like I'm on a phone call, I'm in the middle of something, and then I don't think about it again. And I'm like, oh, I need to contact the handyman. And it's like 4 hours later, right? So that's kind of a one part of it that we didn't mention.
That is awesome. Yeah, what a cool system you've built. And just a huge congrats to you and Emily. It's amazing to see where you guys started and where you are today. It's just absolutely remarkable. And yeah, it's just cool to see the Phi journey in every different version. And I think, like I said, yours was really a prototypical Phi story, and you've turned it into something remarkable. So yeah, James, it's been great getting to know you over the years, and thanks for coming on. I think this is going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So we mentioned rethinktheratrace.com. Is there anything in particular you want to send people to, or anywhere else that you want to send people to?
Absolutely. So rethinktheraatrace.com. I actually have a free ebook that is how to tenant proof your property. This is for both long-term and short-term rentals. And so it's rethinktheraatrace.com/ebook.
Well, that's easy.
Yeah.
Cool. Can't forget that. So, and we will obviously have that linked in the show notes. So, James, my friend, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.